Before we continue, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any powerful messages like this one that will transform your faith. If you are ready to overcome the impossible, this story of Joshua will ignite a courage within you that you may not have even known you had. Have you ever felt like you were facing a challenge so big, so out of your reach, that your only option was to trust or give up? Maybe right now you're struggling with something that seems impossibly a family problem, an emotional struggle, or a dream that seems too far away. If that's you, stop everything and read this carefully. Joshua's story could be the key to transforming your faith and rekindling your courage. Joshua was not a famous warrior when God called him. He was just Moses' assistant, the one who walked behind the scenes while the leader led the people toward the promised land. But there came a time when the baton was passed, and what follows is a true divine manual on how to overcome the impossible when everything depends on faith, obedience, and God's direction. This is not just an old story. It is a prophetic script of how God works today, with those who are willing to stand up, believe, and obey even without understanding all the details of the journey. Get ready on this journey. You will see the Jordan River open, walls fall, promises are fulfilled, and biblical miracles become reality. And most impressive, you will realize that the same God of Israel is ready to use you too. Now, if you're tired of living a lukewarm faith, of feeling trapped in the spiritual desert, or facing struggles with your own strength, this story will turn a key inside you. After all, spiritual victory is not about who shouts the loudest, but about who hears and obeys the voice of God. So are you ready to discover how Joshua became the commander of God's army and led an entire people to conquer the promises? Then come with me. When Moses died, the people of Israel were left like an army without a leader. After all, how could you replace a man who spoke to God face to face? But it was right there, in the midst of uncertainty, that the Lord called Joshua. And it wasn't a timid invitation, it was a divine command. "Arise," said the God of Israel. And with that, Joshua was commissioned to lead the nation into the promised land. He didn't choose this role. God chose it for him. And that changes everything. Joshua did not have the same background as Moses, but it's something essential, a heart willing to obey. God then reinforces, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." This promise carries immense weight, because it was not about repeating the deeds of past, but about walking with the same presence, the same fire, the same glory. The secret was not in man, but in the covenant with God. And this covenant is what sustains leaders in times of crisis to this day. God made it clear from the beginning the mission would not be easy, but Joshua would not be alone. And for this, he received 3 commands that echo to this day for anyone who leads something, be a company, a home, or ministry. Be strong. Be courageous. Obey the law. It's not about feelings. It's about decision. Joshua had to choose to trust, even without seeing immediate results. Faith and obedience, side by side, would be his greatest weapons. It is interesting how the Bible emphasizes that Joshua should meditate on the law day and night. This shows that before conquering cities, he needed to conquer his own heart. There is no spiritual victory without a foundation in the Word. It is no use having a sword if the mind is unprotected. The true army of God begins with people who listen and obey. And Joshua understood this from the beginning. You see, the transition of leadership here was not just institutional, it was spiritual. Joshua did not take on a position, took on a mission. And when you accept what God gives you, even if you are afraid, you are guided by promises, not feelings. And it is with this conviction that he takes the next step, preparing the people for the impossible that would come just ahead. With leadership in place, Joshua wasted no time. He understood that faith is not passivity, it is preparation. So he immediately called the people to prepare, because in 3 days they would cross the Jordan River toward the promised land. Imagine the scene after years in the desert. There was now a promise in sight, but to enter it, organization, unity, and trust in the God of Israel would be necessary. Miracles do happen, but the human part preparation continues to be essential. Joshua sends leaders with clear orders to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Although these tribes have been given territory east of the Jordan, they were not exempt from war. It was time to fight for their brothers. This teaches us something profound. We do not enter promises alone. True conquest requires that we be willing to march together, to fight not just for our own interests, but for the advancement of all God's people. The commitment these tribes showed to Joshua is inspiring. They said, "All that you have commanded us we will do." What strength there is in a community that decides to remain in covenant, without rebellion, without doubt, trusting that this man was, in fact, raised up by God. In a time when obedience has become a rare commodity, seeing a people who submit in faith shows us that victory begins even before the battle light is born of unity and mutual trust. These preparations also included spiritual alignment. The people needed to be attentive to the Lord's instructions, because the conquest of the promised land would not be by human strength or strategy, but by divine intervention. And this is where a timeless principle comes in when you take a stand in faith and obedience. Heaven moves in your favor. Biblical miracles do not happen by chance. They happen when God's people align with His plan. Are you preparing for something God has promised? Perhaps you are expecting a miracle, but have not yet prepared to receive it. Joshua teaches us that promises require readiness. And it is with the spirit of expectation and vigilance that the people approached the next step, a secret mission that would change everything. Spying on Jericho. Before any battle, it is necessary to understand the terrain. Joshua, wise and strategic, sends 2 spies to the fortified city of Jericho. He knew that faith does not exclude prudence. The promised land was before them, but there were still obstacles, and Jericho was the first. The city was known for its insurmountable walls, a true fortress. But Joshua did not trust in human eyes, but in God's promises. Still, he acts responsibly. Faith and action go hand in hand. It is in this context that we meet Rahab, an unlikely woman in human eyes, but a key player in the divine plan. The spies find refuge in her home. Rahab, a prostitute, opens her door and her heart to the men of Israel. She does not protect them by chance. She believes in the God of Israel. Her words are strong. The Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth below. What a statement coming from someone outside the covenant people. God always surprises, using those no one expects. Rahab's faith was not just words. She made a covenant with the spies and sealed her covenant with a sign, a scarlet cord hung from her window. This red thread, simple to the natural eye, became the symbol of her salvation, a powerful reminder that God honors those who believe, regardless of their past. And in a way, this cord also prophetically points to the blood that would one day be shed for us all, a sign of grace in the midst of judgment. Joshua received the report back. The land is given into our hands. The spies didn't just see walls, they saw the hand of God at work. This is something we need to learn. When you walk by faith, you see the unseen. While others see trouble, those who trust in God's promises see open doors. And Jericho, with all its walls, was already tottering from within because fear of God's army had already taken hold of the city. This mission, although secret, marked a turning point. The courage of the spies, the faith of Rahab, and the sealed covenant showed that God was already working behind the scenes. When you move with wisdom, discernment, and confidence, the supernatural begins to manifest itself where you least expect it. And now, with everything ready, comes one of the most impressive moments in the Bible, the crossing of the Jordan River. The time had come when faith had to move from talk to practice. The Jordan River, at flood time, separated the people from the promised land. And God gave Joshua an instruction that, to human eyes, bordered on madness. The priests were to carry the Ark of the Covenant and step into the water. It was that simple. No bridges or boats. The crossing would depend solely on obedience and divine intervention. It was time to believe in biblical miracles or stand still. The Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of the God of Israel, and it led the way. When the priest's feet touched the river, something extraordinary happened. The water stood still, forming an invisible wall, and the riverbed became dry. It was as if God Himself were saying, "If I parted the sea for Moses, I will also part the river for Joshua." The same power, the same faithfulness, the same covenant now in action under new leadership. The entire people crossed on dry land. Men, women, children, leaders, and warriors. An entire nation experienced the miracle. This teaches us that when God decides to act, no one is left out. But it also shows us something essential. We must follow his presence. The priest stood firm in the middle of the river with the ark while the people crossed. In other words, as long as God's presence is sustaining everything, you can move forward with confidence. And Joshua, instructed by the Lord, had a man from each tribe pick up a stone from the riverbed. These 12 stones were set up as a memorial at Gilgal, a sign for future generations. What do these stones mean? Their children would one day ask, and their parents would answer, "Here the Lord has made a way." You too need to set up memorials along your journey. Mark the places where God has made the impossible happen in your life. In addition to the visible memorial, the Bible mentions something profound. Joshua also built an invisible altar in the middle of the Jordan, something between him and God. This shows us that beyond what others see, there are secret, profound, and untransferable moments, places where only you and the Lord know what has been deposited. And it is with a heart full of faith and feet firmly planted in the promise that Joshua leads the people to the next stage, the renewal of the covenant in Gilgal. After the miraculous crossing, Joshua knew that it was not enough to reach the promised land. He needed to renew his covenant with God in order to continue on his journey. One of the most important steps was the circumcision of the people, especially those born during the pilgrimage in the desert. This act was a visible sign of the covenant with God, a commitment that kept the identity of the chosen people alive. Without it, there would be no basis for the victory that was approaching. This circumcision also symbolizes a spiritual break with the past, with habits and practices that hindered progress. Joshua understood that in order to enjoy God's promises, a clean heart and a willingness to obey were necessary. If you are expecting God's best, perhaps it is time to look within, review your commitments, and renew your faith with concrete actions, not just words. Another important milestone at Gilgal was the end of the manna bread from heaven that sustained the people in the wilderness and the beginning of the feeding of the fertile soil of the promised land. This moment represents a spiritual and practical transition. God is saying that the time has come for the harvest, for the fruit of labor, and for the possession of what he has promised. For us, it is an invitation to trust that the promised blessings can be enjoyed, but they require work, faith, and obedience. The celebration of the Passover in Gilgal was an act of remembrance and gratitude, but also of renewed identity. It was the first Passover of a new generation in the Promised Land, a milestone that symbolized a definitive liberation from slavery in Egypt and the opening of a new chapter. God removed the shame of the past, preparing the people to live a mature faith, sustained by the promises and by a living relationship with him. This moment in Gilgal is a lesson for anyone seeking spiritual victory today. Faith is renewed when you connect with God through rituals, commitments, and celebrations that remind you of his promises. The people knew that the next step would require courage and strength, and the renewal of the covenant was a fuel to continue steadfast in the mission that God had prepared. Before setting out for the decisive battle, Joshua had an encounter that would change everything. While he was in prayer or meditation, a heavenly being appeared before him, dressed as a warrior with a drawn sword. He introduced himself as a commander of the army of the Lord, making it clear that this war would not be waged by human forces, but by the mighty hand of God. A stark reminder for all of us: spiritual battles are fought in heaven before they manifest on earth. The message of this encounter was clear and impactful. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. In the face of this manifestation, Joshua understood that he was facing something sacred in order to recognize the divine presence on the battlefield. This teaches us that before acting, we need to recognize the sacredness of the moment and place ourselves in a position of humility. No victory is achieved without reverence for the God of Israel. Joshua realized that his role was to obey and lead with faith, not with human strategies. The commander of the Lord's army was the true general of that war. This revelation is an invitation to all of us who face battles, even when everything seems to depend on us. Victory belongs to God. The best tactic is to trust, pray, and follow God's guidance, even if it seems challenging or contrary to common sense. This encounter reinforces the idea that spiritual success is not the result of individual effort, but a dependence on the power of God. Joshua was called to be strong and courageous, but always remembering that his strength came from a greater source. And this inspires us to look at our own struggles with eyes of faith, knowing that God's army is at our side, ready to act on our behalf. After this powerful vision, Joshua was ready to lead God's army in one of the most impressive campaigns in the Bible. But to do so, he would need to follow a divine plan that to human eyes seemed strange. And that's what we'll talk about next. Joshua was given a strategy by God that seemed unusual by the military standards of the time to march around Jericho once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they would march around Jericho 7 times, accompanied by the sound of trumpets. To a seasoned commander, this might have sounded strange, but Joshua knew he was not just leading a human army, he was following the direction of the God of Israel. Hey, raise a lesson for us all sometimes. God's commands don't make sense to our logic. The people had to trust and obey blindly. During the days of silent march, faith was tested because there was no visible battle, no direct attack. It was as if God was teaching that spiritual victory requires patience and obedience, even when one does not see immediate results. How many times in life do we have to go around in circles, waiting for the walls of the impossible to fall? On the 7th day, with the 7 circuits and the sound of the trumpets, the people let out a unanimous show-you-the sound that represented absolute trust in God. And then something extraordinary happened. The walls of Jericho literally collapsed to the sound of people's faith and obedience. This scene is one of the greatest displays of biblical miracles, showing that God's power overcomes any seemingly insurmountable obstacle. It is important to remember that the fall of the walls did not happen through physical force, but through a collective act of faith and holiness. The human army did not need to invade or destroy with conventional weapons. God fought for his people, and the victory was spiritual before it was material. This teaches us that our greatest battles are won when we place our trust in the Lord's promises and strategies, even when they seem illogical. The conquest of Jericho challenges us to look at our own walls and believe that, even if we don't see how, God can break down barriers to open the way for us. And the next point reveals what is the essential key to making these victories a reality: faith and obedience that must permeate the entire journey. What really caused Jericho to fall? It was not the strength of the soldiers, nor the military strategy that Joshua could devise. The secret lies in the faith and obedience that the people demonstrated. God made it clear from the beginning that this conquest would not be by human arm, but by the holiness of his people and their trust in his promises. Here is a lesson for us: without active faith and sincere obedience, no miracle happens. Faith in this context is not a vague feeling or a passive desire. It is an attitude of unshakable trust that translates into concrete actions, even when circumstances seem contrary. Joshua and the people followed a strategy that to human eyes seemed strange, but they believed that God had a plan. When we act in this way, we open space for the supernatural to operate in our lives. Obedience, in turn, requires discipline and humility. Following God's commands, even when they defy our logic or pride, is what strengthens our alliance with him. The Bible shows that God honors those who faithfully obey him, and Joshua is a living example of this. For you, this may mean saying yes when everything around you says no, trusting the unseen, and standing firm even when doubt knocks at the door. It is important to remember that spiritual victory is a process, not a one-time event. God's promises are fulfilled step by step, and each act of faith and obedience builds a foundation for the next miracle. Just as Joshua erected a memorial stone to commemorate his triumphs, we need to keep the memory of our spiritual victories alive to fuel our courage and hope. Ultimately, Joshua's story challenges us to live an active faith that manifests itself in actions, perseverance, and humility before the God of Israel. God's army is ready to advance, but the decision to march is up to you. And if this journey inspires you, get ready, because we are almost at the end of this incredible story of victory. After learning about the journey of Joshua, a man chosen by God to overcome the impossible question that remains is, what have you done with the promises that God has placed in your heart? Are you, like Joshua, willing to be strong, courageous, and obedient, even when faced with challenges that seem insurmountable? Spiritual victory begins when we decide to trust the God of Israel more than our own strength. Have you ever stopped to reflect on what walls of Jericho are still standing in your life? What barriers have you faced that are perhaps waiting for you to take the first step of faith? Crossing the Jordan River reminds us that the impossible becomes possible when we put God at the center of our journey. And the same goes for you today. How about starting right now to strengthen your faith and renew your covenant with God? This could be through daily Bible reading, sincere prayer, or even simple acts of obedience that you've been putting off. After all, victory is not only for the great leaders of the past, but for all who decide to follow God's path with an open heart. If this story of Joshua touched you, I invite you to reflect what concrete steps can you take starting today to live a victorious faith? And more, do you want to continue receiving content that helps you grow spiritually, strengthen your faith, and conquer your battles? Then be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and keep up with all the news. Your victory is closer than you think. Remember, the God of Israel is faithful, and he walks with you, just as he walked with Joshua.